Coming to you from our opulent and luxurious 4x8 refurbished room closet at the national headquarters in Indianapolis. With duct tape, studio lights, and a mic that you barely can hear, we hope to entertain and educate you. This is the Tango Alpha Lima podcast.
They call me crazy cause I'm facing all my giants. They try to scare me into thinking I can fight it. They tell me I should never even think of trying. But that's just me, I'm gonna live out in defiance.
Hello, and welcome back to the Tango Alpha Lima podcast. I thank God for you two every time we do this, because this is our, I think, fourth time trying to record this because no one hit record, and I don't know what to do, and I just sit here awkwardly. Thank God for you two who absolutely carry the intro to this show. But anyway, let's get on. We have a very special guest today, David Fisher. I know I say it every time, but he is definitely a very special guest. He's a two-time combat veteran. He served as a Marine during Desert Storm, and then again in OIF, where he served in the Navy in Iraq. He served in a number of MOSs, including as a Special Warfare Intelligence Specialist. But the reason we have him on here today is he went on to earn a BA in Quantitative Methods and Computer Science and a Master's in International Management from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. He then completed a PhD in depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute in California. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on moral injury of combat veterans. To keep his work alive and advancing in the world, he formed the Moral Injury Institute to publish and educate everything about moral injury. And the Moral Injury Institute offers a series of free self-study courses with optional paid lectures, and the payment is very low, so definitely take a look at those. He also wrote a book, Moral Injury and the Promise of Virtue, which is available on Amazon, and he's a Legion member in Post 25 in Cottonwood, Arizona. So without further ado, we will head right on over after this quick commercial break and meet with David Fisher, again with the Moral Injury Institute.
So you were discharged with a 20% disability rating, but now you can't hear so well and need help. Contact an American Legion service officer. Service officers are free of charge and they help all veterans. Find one near you with our online tool at legion.org/service officers.
Okay, and now we are joined by David Fisher of the Moral Injury Institute. David, thank you so much for joining us today, and we appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. And I believe we're going to start with Ashley today.
Yes. So David, thank you for being here. Super excited. Impressed by your bio. This is a very near and dear topic to myself, and I'm so glad that we're having the conversation today. And I wanted to ask you, what kind of incited the concept of moral injury, how it became kind of this passion project to everything that kind of now encompasses both your doctorate and your education. How did you get here?
Yeah, so I'm a two-time deployed combat vet, once with the Marine Corps in Desert Storm, and after 6 years in the Corps, I got out, and then after 9/11, too old and fat for the Marine Corps anymore, so I joined the Navy Reserve thinking, well, this time I might actually shoot from 500 miles, not 500 meters. Well, didn't quite work out that way, as the main character in Apocalypse Now said, I wanted a mission, and for my sins they gave me one. So I ended up in special warfare intel, and so I ended up deploying to Iraq in 2005 and 6, and was briefing missions there for a Spec Ops helicopter squadron. Shout out to HCS 4 and 5. And so when I came back, one of the things I noticed was PTSD, what was described as PTSD, really wasn't what I was experiencing. And so, you know, I was kind of looking around and trying to find, something that resonated. So I ended up reading a book by Jonathan Shea called Odysseus in America. And that's what really kind of catapulted me into going back and doing a PhD and getting started on the topic.
That's impressive. I have to really, I mean, especially as we discuss moral injury a little bit more in depth here today, you kind of have researched it in the context of war veterans, and the concept itself is not just confined to a singular community. I think that's really profound because there's really a ripple of moral injury, I think, in the United States in multiple facets. But I'm really excited to see that you've really hit the ground running, and you have, self-study courses, you've got paid lectures, you have a book, you have all of these amazing, materials and resources. So I'm really excited that you're on here today, David, and I will let my wonderful esteemed colleagues fire away with their questions.
You're up, Michigan.
All right, go blue. I before I get to the intellectual stuff, I just have to know. I don't understand how someone can go from the military branch to the Uber branch that carries the aforementioned military to work. Everything from the uniform to like all of it, I just don't get it. You don't have to answer that if you don't want to, but it's just baffling me, sir. But I was looking at your website.
Yep.
And I went to the free courses because in the description of them, free, it interested me. But when I got there, I noticed an extensive reading list. Extensive reading list. And this Marine, who was only a Marine, saw an extensive reading list and said, that ain't free. That's costing me some time. So what I'm wondering, who is the target audience for that certification? It's not for the morally injured, I assume. It's more targeted towards people who already have a psychology degree, or who's your target for that information?
Yeah, it's actually both. If you look at the readings, almost all of them, with the exception of where I'm recommending reading a whole book, I actually have the PDFs uploaded that you can download. Now, in terms for free. So, but in terms of time invested, yes. I mean, I try to run the gamut, right? Of here's, if you want and you're a researcher, here are references that really tie together a lot of these threads, right? Because as Ashley said, right now, Dr. Wendy Dean, she's a psychiatrist, but she is really focused on medical. So moral injury in the medical profession, especially with COVID going on right now, where you have a lot of professionals not able to align with their own personal ethic. But to come back to what you were talking about, so the audience is both. And I think I try to pull together a thread that will appeal to the average veteran or Marine, but you can cherry pick, so there's fiction, there's poetry, there's an organization called Military Experience in the Arts, and so a lot of poetry that I cite there is also comes from them and from veterans. And so when I did my actual doctoral work, that was one of the big differentiators was I said, I'm going to use poetry of the average veteran, not going after these kind of high in, canonical, as we would say, um, poets like Wilfred Owen or Sassoon or some of these British poets that are well known for their poetry about war and being a veteran. So I think the audience is both. I think that especially kind of the foundations of moral injury, I'm trying to be much more accessible there. Um, some of the other ones where I'm talking about, differentiating between PTSD and moral injury, those tend to get a little bit more technical, simply because we're dealing with a diagnosis that's recognized by, say, VA or even the American Psychological Association versus one that's not. So you really have to define them in opposition.
Well, that's cool because that you mentioned the VA because I was wondering because of your separation from PTS to moral injury, is the VA part of your audience, and are you trying to affect their policies and how they treat and interact with their patients, i.e., veterans?
Very much so. And if you look at, Jonathan Shea, he's the first one. He was a VA psychologist. So he really pushed for it. And of course, others have taken up that mantle within VA, mostly out of Boston. So some out of San Francisco, but
You just got Mark all excited.
That's
when
all you
said
gotta do is
Boston.
mention Massachusetts. I'm all in.
Ooh, calm him down over there.
so so you know so yes, part of my intent is to keep that ball rolling. You see the work that EdTech did and does, with taking veterans back to Vietnam and doing reconciliation. So all these are meant to try to, force VA into considering something besides medicalized, diagnostic criteria.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that, and I look forward to diving into one of the books at least, and then learning
If
a
you
little
have
bit.
cliff notes, send them.
I recommend it, for an easy read. I recommend The Road Back by Mark. It's the follow-on to All Quiet on the Western Front. So,
All right. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Seavey.
If I could turn my video camera around here and show you the disaster that is my room, though, you would find an entire collection of Rudyard Kipling, who is the greatest war poet, in my opinion, of all time.
right.
I did want to mention Jonathan Shea, as you were talking about him. I pulled it up, and it said he is best known for his publications comparing the experiences of Vietnam veterans with the descriptions of war in the Homecoming in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. I'm all in on that. We got the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Vietnam War. That is my sweet spot. And I will say that, like Jeff, I went almost immediately to the website, and I started looking through the bibliography because I love bibliographies. But you have everything here from St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas to more recent stuff. So it definitely runs the gamut. But my question actually has nothing to do with that. It's more about the Moral Injury Institute itself. And you talk about it here in sort of the About section where you say, what is a moral injury? We at the Moral Injury Institute define moral injury as witnessing, whether in person, through reporting, or some other means, something that causes a crisis of conscience due to a violation of one's deeply held moral, religious, or ethical beliefs, such that one physically or psychically, suffers in a material adverse way. And then you go into some examples, and I think it might help to kind of dumb it down for us infantry guys if you really talked about what some of those examples are.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a great quote. Well, not great, but it really succinctly brings this home. And it's, can you imagine sipping tea in a man's living room while you pay him for killing his child? I mean, if you really think about what that would do to somebody. And also, another one. How could I ever teach my daughter right from wrong given what I have done? So, when you think about that kind of crisis, that's very different than how PTSD is described and how it's diagnosed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why you have that intersection of theology, right? Um, you can go to Nietzsche on the genealogy of morals if you want, where do they come from? Um, it goes into philosophy of how do you kind of intersect all these different things that have been described for millennia. You know, you mentioned the Odyssey and Homer. There's a great line within there. Now you're burnt out husks, your spirit's haggard, always brooding over your wanderings long and hard. Your heart's never lifting any joy. You've suffered far too much. So, you start putting those in context of what war is, and you juxtapose that with, at least in the Western tradition of Christianity or Judaism, of thou shalt not kill, right? And yet here you are participating in killing. And so it's really trying to understand and dive at, and that's why Aquinas comes in, because of course he's the one who pretty much wrote the just war doctrine that's still, ensconced in the Catholic Catechism. So, does that kind of get at where you were asking?
So it as opposed to PTSD injury, this is more an internal conflict where you are either do or see something that conflicts, and your own rational basis is kind of thrown out of whack, and it's a struggle to bring it back within the scope of what you had previously encountered.
Right.
Yeah.
You don't have any frame of reference for how do you justify this.
Right. Yep. All right. Well, let's take a quick commercial break, and then we'll be right back with David Fisher.
The American Legion is Veterans Strengthen America. We're in your community, supporting veterans, service members, and their families, enriching the lives of young people and promoting citizenship and patriotism. Our members are passionate about these core values. Help strengthen America by joining the American Legion today. For more information, go to legion.org/join.
Okay, and we are back with David Fisher, and once again for round two, Ashley will go first.
Awesome. Well, David, I really appreciate, again, you speaking to us on this. As somebody who really resonates with this topic, I can say that, in the past few years, in my own struggle and, trying to better understand, what I went through in service as a female vet, to some of the deeply entrenched values that I always felt were not necessarily, held, or I was just always disappointed, in the folks that, I was serving with, or, leadership failed me, right? And there was always this consistent moral injury. And one of the things that I always turned to was stoicism, which is pretty much like the idea of focus, like on what you can control, and like not worrying so much about what you cannot control. And I think for any of our listeners or viewers out there, for anyone who's ever had moral injury, it's really, from a hallmark and symptom standpoint, it's distressing, psychological behavior. It's social, sometimes it's spiritual aftermath, exposure of such events. And I know that there's a lot of research specifically for the nature of war and combat. But, there's a lot of overlap, as we've discussed. And I just kind of wanted to better understand, David, like where some of, like, Mark kind of pointed out, we have this kind of gambit of things. Like, what is your go-to? Like, what is, that one poet, that one writer, that one researcher, the one person you kind of go back that gives you the solace that allows you to continue to spearhead such a difficult topic?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's a book of poetry, The Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart. It's not specifically just for, moral injury or combat veterans, but it has a wide range of poetry that really, really kind of resonates in terms of, what is it like to be a person in the world, be a moral person. And I think that's probably one of my top ones. I read a lot of Rumi, bit ironic given that, he's an Islamic poet. But, if you he's also very inspirational because it goes back to your own personal experience and what do you have to do, right, in order to feel whole and to be right. And so those are probably my two big go-tos. If poetry's not your thing per se, Dr. Meager, which is M as in Mary, Eagher, recently came out with a book called The Moral Injury Reader, which has snippets from both, combat vets, classical scholars like he is, as well as poetry and just writings, right? What does it mean? What is moral injury in different ways of showcasing it? But in terms of more inspirational, holding the center, those two first books really, for me, sum it up.
No, I think that's great. And I definitely want to make sure we get those recommendations in our cliff notes here. I think in a very it's been a very interesting, I guess, first few months of 2021. And if I say first few months, which feels like in itself, like the first week felt like a very, very long year for a lot of Americans. And I think that there's now a lot of contemplation and that moral injury, I think, is now really going to be an increased of awareness, right?
Right.
Whether you identify, red, blue, in between, purple, whatever the case may be, I think there's a lot of overlapping context and how some of these resources can really help not only veterans but other folks trying to figure out this fine balance of morality in the 21st century. And I just think that is so incredibly important. And I kind of have just a quick follow-up too, and
Sure.
that a pretty normal hallmark reaction to moral injury is like the inability to self-forgive, or consequently have these engaging or maybe disengaging self-sabotaging behaviors, and feeling like you just don't deserve to succeed at work or relationships. And I kind of wanted to get your insight on one of these like hallmark kind of what's the word I'm looking for, I'm trying to think. It's just pretty much like when that individual like is incurring that transgression, right, with themselves and the world around them, whether that's guilt, shame, disgust, anger. It's like how do you combat some of those things from an internal standpoint, and how have you gone about articulating those to the public through your speaking engagements?
Yeah, I think the word you're looking for is what we call in psychology introjection, which is internalizing, something that something's wrong with me or some, whatever. But to your point, I think, James Hillman was pretty famous for saying, and I make this point in my dissertation, the conclusion, which is, why is there moral injury? Or what, we would say, was the telos of moral injury? And ironically, it's, I think, to make you suffer to the point of self-awareness. And, of you'll have these dreams, you'll have these interpersonal problems, with relationships, or like you said, not feeling worthy. And I think, to a certain degree, what James Hillman would always say was, you have to sit in that. Sometimes you have to descend to the point where you're finally like, I've had enough. And hopefully, in the context of vets, that bottom not having enough is not suicide, right? Which is a huge issue. But as they say about, alcoholics or, drug abusers, you have to hit rock bottom before you can find a way back out. And I use the labyrinth, the Minotaur and the labyrinth myth to describe that, right? Which is, sometimes you have to go into the labyrinth and fight the demon on its own grounds, and then, but you have to have a person who's unspooling the string as you go in.
To pull you out. To support, right? I think that's so important. I used to always tell folks it's near impossible to beat an enemy with an outpost inside your head.
Right.
As as a mental health advocate, as someone who actively, battles depression, anxiety, moral injury, military sexual trauma, all of the above, I feel sometimes like I'm checking more boxes. And I understand how impactful this research is and what it means to not only women veterans, but veterans in general, and for all of the folks who sometimes even feel conflicted out of something that's happening at work or the loss of someone. You know, we're in a very interesting year where a lot of folks haven't been able to mourn properly, or, you know, have felt very, you know, pitted against parties, right? So there's so many applications to this. And I think that it's really important. And I'm hearing you say, you know, having that string, that spool that's attached, and having that support network, having someone to kind of pull you back out, and finding whatever works for you, right? Whether it's poetry, therapy, group therapy, you know, medication. Like, there is a combination of things that can help. And I've taken up a lot of time. I know Mark and Jeff are probably like, ooh, I have questions, or Ashley took my question, which is very common. I just think that this is so important, and this is a very important topic to me. So I can't encourage our listeners, viewers enough. Like, having a support network is so important. Finding what works for you, and it's a critical conversation, and we should be having it. So thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Jeff, you are up.
Took all my questions.
Of course you did.
Sorry, Jeff.
I wanted
like
I'd want to first of all, I want to acknowledge and thank you for not just saying, but putting on display the depth of your passion and where the intensity of your motivation and how that manifests itself in your being. So no one who is experiencing what you're talking about today, the way that you're talking about today, can ever question the importance of what you are talking about. I just wanted to acknowledge that straight off. Secondly, because of that, because of the heartfelt, soul-emptying passion that you have for this, and it's evident that it's a process and it's working for you in your life. I'm curious, in your work and in other people who do similar work, what kinds of big win stories are you having? What kinds of impacts are you finding that people have by taking your approach versus the traditional approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think to use an analogy, you know, I think unfortunately a lot of, you know, PTSD treatment at VA, while it's helpful, and like I think I mentioned, but maybe not yet, you can have PTSD and moral injury at the same time, but they are different things. So I'm not denigrating the work, you know, VA does with PTSD. It's important. You know, my own personal story, when I came back from Desert Storm, you know, my dad worked construction on these big condos in Florida, you know, the 30-story type. So I was walking up the job site, up the stairwell, and just come out on the floor. And of course, it's concrete. So what are they doing? They're shooting framing with a concrete nailer, which is a 22 round shooting a nail. One of the things went off. Before I knew it, I low crawled behind a pile of scrap, you know, on the job site. Well, I got over that pretty quick. You know, it was a couple weeks back. Things, you know, stuff like that doesn't freak me out. But the point is, like PTSD, there are things you can do for that. And they're important. And now I lost my thread where I was going.
Well, that's fine, because I still have a follow-up based on what you just said and something that you said earlier. I am not in any way, shape, or form an expert on. I'm not on a novice level of any of this. I took psychology 101 as a freshman, and that is about as deep as I go into this. So I'm going to ask you this to explain it to me, because I feel like a lot of people, I don't have all of that stuff. But when I heard you describe the moral injury, what I picked up were the examples of you saying, how do I teach my daughter to do this when I did this? And to me, PTS seems, it's more of a physical, mental, like, relationship, and that affects how you interact with the world, right?
Right.
And to me now, moral injury sounds like a lot of questioning that goes on in your brain, and an evaluation of worth to the people who are around you that matter. That am I getting kind of the difference between the two?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a very succinct way of saying that. And, yes, when I look at moral injury, it's really comes back to, in my mind, am I worthy of still being loved, right? And there we're not necessarily talking about love in the romantic sense. We're talking about love as in, am I worthy of my fellow human beings, admiration and just humanity, right? So you're right, that's a very internalized process versus PTSD, which is often focused on, something blowing up in front of you, and now you have a hyper reaction to loud noise, or you have hyper reaction to crowds. Well, as most research would tell you, that's not a dis-ease in terms of disease. It's a dis-ease because that's something that kept you alive, right? So that what psychologists would say is a hyperreaction may be that half second that saved your life because you reacted using your lizard brain, as we say, not using your frontal cortex. So you react rather than think about and say, oh, I should really duck. Well, I don't know if anybody here's a hunter. I'm not really a hunter, but I have lots of friends who bow hunt. And a deer will actually bow its back because it can hear the string of the bow and the arrow release, and that arrow will miss because they're not thinking about it, right? They're not like, oh, I think I heard something. What's that up in the tree? Oh, right? They immediately bow their back because that's a reaction. And so, yes, when we're talking about moral injury, in opposition to that, or in tension with that, you're talking about your own internalized feeling of self-worth. So
I appreciate that. My Psychology 101 professors will appreciate that I was able to synthesize all that information.
A plus, Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff. I just
Look at
Jeff
this guy.
breaking it down Barney style was awesome. Like totally. I felt you, man. That was awesome.
Yeah, I
So-
think this is important because, I mean, Like, I think there's a great deal of overlap, which we've brought up between moral injury and post-traumatic stress disorder. And I think regardless, like, they both begin with an event that often is life-threatening or harmful to yourself or others. But I think where moral injury, can obviously have, or I'm trying to think, like, so like guilt and shame are more of the core features of moral injury, but they're also symptoms of PTSD. So the betrayal or loss or trust could be experienced moral injury and also be a common feature of PTSD. So for example, for someone who say was assaulted by a loved one, the feeling of betrayal or having difficulty trusting others, or whether or not, they've suffered moral injury or PTSD, they could technically have both, but regards to the difference in that situation, the PTSD would include the symptoms of hyperarousal or hyperactivity or something that's, not central to necessarily moral injury, but our innate human response to the stress, right? Flight or fight. And then, when you look at the other core features of moral injury overlap with the symptoms or common features of PTSD, it's possible to have moral injury but not meet the criteria for PTSD. And a lot of people don't know that.
Right.
It's, I'm trying to think of just some of the things that I'm recalling from like my own research and how I've had to make the distinction even in my own VA claims, right?
Right.
But having moral injury in addition to PTSD is often associated with greater PTSD and depression symptom severity and greater likelihood of suicidal intent and behaviors. And I think that's what's so interesting and important about this is that, unfortunately, it adds another layer of things that have to be addressed, right? That labyrinth, that maze that you're trying to work around, because you can separate the two out from the physicality, right? As you explained, David, when you heard that concrete cement, round golf, you're like, oh man, your reaction, just as your deer example is, okay, I gotta take cover, I gotta
Right.
move, I like that is instinctive. Whereas the moral injury lingers a bit. It lingers long because what it does is it resonates, and then you build these walls around that trauma, trying to find some way to rationalize that
Right.
or continue on, and then having a repeat of that trauma different in a different circumstance or something that could trigger you to remember that incident. It's kind of like a weird ripple effect. So that was my
What was your question?
Psychology 102.
Oh,
All right,
Sorry,
I'm gonna
I
be
mean-
very brief here because we're running long. But David, what can we do to help you with your mission? What can the American Legion do, and what can the three of us do?
Well, I think it's A, just as having me on has probably done a lot of good. Obviously, I can I'll pump my website, themoraliinjuryinstitute.com. If you want to reach out, there's contact info there. If you want me to connect you with resources, I can do that. Have questions about the reading, think it's too much investment, I can point you to a more succinct, reading list that maybe gets you uh, more ideas and learn how to use the language, right? Particularly if you're seeing a psychologist, whether they're VA or not, whether you're talking to, a priest or a preacher or some religious person, having the language helps you um, help them help you, if that makes sense, right? Because if you're focused on just, say the VA claim process, as Ashley mentioned, you have to use certain language in order for that to be effective. Ditto with speaking to somebody about moral injury. I think also if you're with somebody who has moral injury, the biggest thing you can do is just listen, particularly without judgment and without trying to offer solutions.
That's a rule in my household, David. Are you asking for a solution or am I just listening?
But
That has literally cleared 98% of any marital issues I've had. Am I listening or am I providing a solution? And I joke about that, but you bring up excellent points. Excellent points.
so, other than that, if you have questions, reach out. Super happy to have been here and been on the show.
All right, David, thank you very much for joining us. And we will be right back with Jeff and Ashley in a moment. And David, again, thanks for coming on. And we will, of course, tout your website and your book. And thank you for joining us.
You bet.
All right, so we have been listening to a very emotional podcast with David Fisher of the Moral Injury Institute. Jeff, once again, you synthesized it for tiny little brain me, and I totally got where you were going. So I got to applaud you. I know that probably pains Ashley almost as much as it pains me. But Ashley, what's your 25-second takeaway on this one?
Sure. I just think that David's message is incredibly important, and I'll stress again that it's impossible to defeat an enemy with an outpost inside your head. And there are so many resources out there and tools. Folks understand what moral injury is, and I think that there's a path moving forward. So I was really thankful for David's very passionate and touching commitment to this cause.
Yeah. And Jeff, at the risk of praising you once again, what was your takeaway?
Really, I had two things. I learned a lot because it's not my sphere of expertise, which is massive, but doesn't include any of this. And second,
is being humble.
I don't know. Put that on the bingo card.
Jeff, that was great, though. Go on.
The second thing was, he took it from a level of just intellectualism, which is important, but I think the bigger thing that resonated with me was the genuine passion and feelings and a really, really strong something good. I'm not losing the word. That is his motivation, just a strong motivation rooted in something really genuine. And that, to me, we spent a lot of time talking, and that, to me, is the key right there.
Yeah, I think there's an image, fair or unfair, about psychiatrists and psychologists that they're so emotionally distant that you can't really connect with them. He doesn't come at it from a strictly scholarly point of view. Obviously, he lives it, feels it, loves it, lives it. So, again, I look at the big brain on Brad over there, Jeff Daly, with his massive spheres of expertise. Jeff is just winning the day for me. But again, so that was David Fisher, and his website, again, is themoralingryinstitute.com. And you should go on there and check out the bibliography section, as Jeff mentioned, is huge. But as he also mentioned in the show, he does kind of pare it down for some of the things, and I looked at those online as we were talking to him. They're great. And again, his book, Moral Injury and the Promise of Virtue, is available on Amazon. So I commend you to go check it out. Jeff, Ashley, thank you guys for taking time out of your week to join me. And everybody who's listening, we appreciate you, and we couldn't appreciate more when you come here. Remember to subscribe to the Tango Alpha Lima podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And while you're there, review and rate us, only 5 stars. If you want to send us feedback or love letters, particularly to Jeff, you can do it on YouTube or Facebook, or send us an email to tangoalphalima@legion.org. Ladies, this man with the huge sphere of expertise is still available, and he is priced to move. So send your love letters to tangoalphalima@legion.org. Thank you.